The silence in the apartment was a physical weight. Ilara Vance sat on the floor, surrounded by cardboard boxes that smelled of dust and defeat, a single piece of paper trembling in her hand. It was an eviction notice, the stark black letters a final, brutal judgment. 7 days. She felt her heart hammer against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of bone. A wave of cold nausea churned in her gut, the same sickening feeling she'd had the day the bankers, with their apologetic, pitiless eyes, explained her husband's secret. He hadn't just died. He had taken their entire world with him, gambling away a lifetime of security in secret, shameful increments. She was no longer a grieving widow. She was a fool, a co-signer to a catastrophe she never saw coming. Her gaze drifted over the pale rectangles on the walls where their family photos used to hang. Now, the space felt alien, stripped bare, its emptiness echoing the hollow space in her chest. The only sound was the faint, rhythmic breathing of her 10-year-old son, Leo, asleep in the other room, blissfully unaware that their home was dissolving around them. She forced herself to look at the numbers again, the reality of their situation laid bare on her worn laptop screen. 2,150. That was it. The sum total of their existence, scraped together from the sale of her wedding ring, her husband's watch, and the last of her emergency funds from her librarian days. A pathetic little shield against a mountain of debt that bore his name, but now belonged entirely to her. She could feel the icy tendrils of panic wrap around her throat, making it hard to breathe. The number was an insult, a joke. She ran a hand over her face, the skin feeling tight and foreign, her stomach twisted with a hunger that was now 2 days old, a dull, persistent ache she was learning to ignore. Everything she had, the last of the bread and milk, was for Leo. He needed to keep his strength. He needed to believe things were okay, even as she felt herself crumbling from the inside out. Her role as a mother had become a desperate performance, a lie she whispered to him at night while the truth screamed silently in her own head. They were falling, and she had nothing to grab onto. A shiver, born of hunger and fear, traced a cold path down her spine. The faint, sweet smell of the old books she had packed away, her only remaining treasures, was a cruel reminder of the life she had lost. A life of order, of quiet purpose, of stories with clear beginnings and satisfying ends. Now, her own story was a chaotic, terrifying mess. She closed her eyes, and the world behind her lids was a dizzying kaleidoscope of red-letter warnings and final notices. The heating had been cut off last week, and the creeping chill of the October night seeped through the thin apartment walls, a harbinger of the cold, hard street that awaited them. She pulled a threadbare blanket around her shoulders, the cheap wool scratching at her skin. It offered no real warmth, no comfort against the profound cold that had settled deep in her bones. It was the cold of absolute loneliness, the feeling that the entire world was moving on without them, indifferent to their quiet. Desperate struggle for survival. She was invisible. They were invisible. The grief for her husband had long ago curdled into a cold, hard knot of anger in her stomach. She stared at a small, framed photo of him she hadn't been able to pack, his easy smile now looking like a mask. A cruel deception. How could he? The question was a constant, corrosive presence in her mind. How could he look her in the eye every day, knowing he was building their family's future on a foundation of lies and bad bets? How could he do this to Leo? Her fists clenched, her fingernails digging painful crescents into her palms. The sound of a distant siren wailed outside, a lonely cry in the city's vast, uncaring night. She felt a tear, hot and sharp, escape and trace a path through the grime on her cheek. She didn't bother to wipe it away. The tears were a nightly ritual now, a silent, solitary release of the pressure that built up inside her all day. She had to be strong for Leo. She had to be the calm center of his world, even as her own was being torn apart by a hurricane of debt and despair. With a deep, shuddering breath, Ilara turned back to the laptop. Its pale, clinical glow was the only light in the room, casting long, distorted shadows that danced like specters on the walls. Her fingers, stiff with cold, hovered over the keyboard. She had spent hours, days, scrolling through job listings that required degrees she couldn't prove, rental ads that demanded credit scores she no longer had, and charity websites with waiting lists years long. Every click was a dead end. Every link was a door slamming shut in her face. Hope was a luxury she could no longer afford. Desperation was the air she breathed. Her gaze scanned the screen, her eyes gritty from exhaustion, searching for anything, a loophole, a forgotten classified as a one-in-a-million miracle. This was it, the final desperate search before the end. The blinking cursor was a mocking heartbeat, counting down the seconds to homelessness. Her story was on the brink of a tragic ending, but a new, unforeseen chapter was about to begin. If you believe in second chances and fighting for your family against all odds, subscribe to our channel and follow Ilara's incredible journey. And then, she saw it. Tucked away at the bottom of a municipal website, under a drab heading for public auctions, was a line of text that seemed to hum with an impossible energy. Symbolic property transfer, Blackwood Manor. Her tired, gritty eyes narrowed, reading it again. Symbolic transfer. For $1. It had to be a typo, a cruel digital joke designed to prey on the desperate. But her finger, acting of its own accord, moved the cursor and clicked. The page took an eternity to load, each second stretching into a painful minute. She held her breath, a knot of cynical disbelief tightening in her stomach. Yet, beneath it, a tiny, treacherous seed of hope began to sprout. A manor. The word itself was absurd, a fantasy, but for $1, it was a fantasy she had to chase. Her heart fluttered, a weak, hesitant beat against the relentless drum of her despair. It was the first glimmer of light she'd seen in an endless, suffocating tunnel, and she lunged toward it with everything she had left. The image that finally materialized was a single, grainy black and white photograph. It showed a grand, Gothic structure, complete with a stone turret and sprawling wings, framed by ancient, gnarled trees. It looked like something out of a Bronte novel, imposing, romantic, and shrouded in mystery. The text was dry and bureaucratic. Sold as is for the symbolic sum of $1 to any party willing to assume all outstanding property taxes and liability. Liability. The word gave her a brief pause, but it was quickly bulldozed by the sheer, overwhelming possibility. A roof. A permanent roof over their heads. She did a quick, frantic search for the back taxes. The amount was just under $2,000, almost every penny she had, but it was a concrete number, a tangible price for survival. A home. The word echoed in the empty chambers of her heart, and for the first time in weeks, she felt a jolt of adrenaline that wasn't born of pure panic. It felt like a divine intervention, a lifeline thrown into a raging sea. This wasn't a decision, it was a reflex. The only other path led directly to a homeless shelter, to separating from Leo, to a final, irrevocable defeat. She looked over at the doorway to his room, where he slept. Trusting her completely to keep the monsters at bay, she couldn't fail him. Not again. With trembling hands, she navigated the county's clunky online payment portal, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She entered her debit card number, the last link to her old life, and watched as their meager savings vanished from the screen. $2,150 became $157.34. A wave of dizziness washed over her, but she pushed it down. This was an investment in their future. She told herself the manor's isolation would be a blessing, a quiet place to heal. The lack of interior photos wasn't a red flag. It was a blank canvas, an adventure, a story they would one day tell about how they started over with nothing but a key and a mountain of courage. The lie was beautiful, and for a few hours, she allowed herself to believe it. The next 48 hours were a blur of frantic activity. She packed their few remaining belongings into the cardboard boxes that had become monuments to their failure, their smell of defeat now mingling with a new scent of frantic hope. She used the last of their cash to hire a battered moving truck with a driver whose face seemed permanently fixed in a skeptical scowl. "Blackwood Manor," he'd grunted, his voice a gravelly rumble. "You sure about that, lady? Ain't nobody lived out there in my lifetime." Ilara waved away his concern with a confidence she didn't feel. "It's a historical property. We're restoring it," she said, the words feeling foreign and grand in her mouth. The journey out of the city was a reverse pilgrimage. They left the familiar grid of streets and the distant hum of life, plunging deeper and deeper into a countryside that grew wilder and more desolate with every passing mile. The smooth highway gave way to cracked asphalt, which in turn dissolved into a rutted dirt road. Her knuckles were white on the cheap vinyl seat. The world outside the truck's dirty window transformed. Neat suburban lawns melted into sprawling, unkempt fields, which were then swallowed by a dense, dark forest that seemed to press in on the narrow road from all sides. The canopy of ancient, interlocking branches was so thick it cast the road in a premature twilight, the air growing noticeably cooler. Leo, who had started the trip buzzing with the excitement of moving to a castle, grew quiet. He pressed his face against the cold glass, his small breath fogging the pain. "Mom," he whispered, his voice small and uncertain. "It's getting spooky. Are we almost there?" Ilara forced a bright smile, though she felt a cold knot of apprehension tightening in her own stomach. "Almost, sweetie. Our own private kingdom in the woods. No noisy neighbors." Her attempt at cheerfulness sounded thin and shrill, a fragile sound against the growing deep silence of the woods. The driver just shook his head, his eyes fixed on the treacherous road ahead. The truck coughed and sputtered to a stop before a pair of immense, rusted iron gates. They were choked with thick, thorny vines and dark green ivy, as if the forest were actively trying to swallow them whole. One gate sagged on a broken hinge, leaning inward at a drunken angle. A wooden sign so weathered by time and rain that the paint was nearly gone was nailed to a stone pillar. In faint, ghostly letters, she could just make out the words, "Blackwood Manor." "This is as far as I go," the driver announced, already unlatching his seatbelt. "The driveway ain't fit for this vehicle, and I ain't getting stuck out here." Without another word, he began unloading their boxes, dropping them onto the damp, leaf-strewn ground with careless thuds. The sound of his truck's engine reversing and then fading into the distance was horrifyingly final. Then an absolute, unnerving silence fell, so profound it felt like a physical pressure against her eardrums. The air was cold and carried the heavy, wet scent of earth and decay. They were alone, utterly and completely alone. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was predatory. It was filled with the faint, unsettling rustle of unseen creatures in the dense undergrowth and the lonely, echoing call of a crow somewhere high above. Ilara felt a new kind of fear bloom in her chest, a primal dread that had nothing to do with bills or eviction notices. This was the fear of isolation, of being so far removed from the world that their screams would never be heard. She could feel Leo's small hand creep into hers, his grip tight and cold. "Mom, I'm scared," he breathed. And his fear was a mirror of her own. She squeezed his hand, trying to project a strength she was nowhere near feeling. "It's okay, baby. We're here." She took a deep, shaky breath that did little to calm her hammering heart. Gritting her teeth, she hoisted the heaviest box into her arms, the cardboard digging into her skin, and took the first step through the broken gates and onto the dark, overgrown path. It felt like crossing a threshold into another world. As they rounded a bend in the winding, weed-choked driveway, the manor revealed itself, and it broke her. It rose from the landscape not like a castle, but like the carcass of some great, slain beast. The single black-and-white photo had been a masterwork of deception. This was no romantic ruin, it was a Gothic horror. An entire wing of the house had collapsed into a skeletal pile of splintered timbers and rubble. The turret she had admired was half gone, its stone gaping open to the grey sky. The windows that weren't boarded up were shattered, leaving dark, vacant sockets that seemed to stare down at them with malevolent emptiness. Long, black streaks of mold and water damage ran down the stone facade like dried tears. The cloying smell of rot intensified, a suffocating miasma of wet plaster, mildew, and something else. A faint, foul sweetness that turned her stomach. The last vestiges of her fragile hope didn't just fade, they shattered into a million pieces. She had made a terrible, terrible mistake. Leo made a small, choked sound and stopped walking, pulling back on her hand. His face, pale and wide-eyed, was turned up toward the monstrous facade. "That's not it, is it, Mom?" he asked, his voice a tiny, trembling whisper that was nearly swallowed by the oppressive silence. "It's a monster house." Ilara couldn't form words. Her throat was tight, her lungs refusing to draw in the foul air. All she could do was stare at the ruin, the catastrophic proof of her own desperation and foolishness. The $2,000, The last barrier between her son and the cold, hard street was gone. In its place stood this monument to decay. The nausea she had been fighting for days surged into her throat, hot and acidic. She had failed. In her frantic bid to save them, she had led her child from the precipice of one disaster and straight into the heart of another. The weight of her guilt was a physical force, pressing down on her shoulders, threatening to drive her to her knees right there on the weed-choked gravel. This was the end. Her body moved on autopilot, a numb automaton carrying her forward. She stumbled up the 3 crumbling stone steps to the main entrance, the front door, a massive slab of oak dark with age and moisture, hung precariously from a single groaning hinge. Even a gentle push was enough to swing it inward. The sound it made was a deep, protracted shriek of tortured metal and rotting wood, a sound of protest that echoed through the cavernous darkness within as if the house itself was screaming. A cloud of stale, cold air billowed out to meet them, carrying a complex and horrifying stench. It was the smell of a forgotten tomb, a foundation of damp earth and stone, layered with the sharp scent of mildewed books and fabrics, the acrid tang of animal droppings, and the pervasive, sickeningly sweet perfume of decay that hinted at things long dead. A violent shiver traced its way down her spine. Her heart plummeted. This wasn't a home. This was a place to be buried. The sliver of grey light from the open door did little to penetrate the gloom, but it was enough to reveal the full extent of the nightmare. The grand entryway she had fantasized about was a scene of utter destruction. A huge, jagged hole gaped in the ceiling 3 stories above, and through it, the bleak sky looked down. Directly below the hole, a mountain of debris was piled on the cracked marble floor. Splintered roof beams, chunks of plaster the size of tombstones, and a thick carpet of sodden, blackened leaves. Stagnant pools of dark water had collected in the low points of the floor, their surfaces shimmering with a greasy, rainbow-colored film. And everywhere, there was the mold. It wasn't just a stain. It was a living entity, thick, black, and velvety. It crawled up the stone walls and across the tattered remnants of silk wallpaper, its fuzzy tendrils like grasping fingers. The air was so heavy with its spores that each breath felt like a physical effort, a gritty, poisonous coating on her tongue. Beside her, Leo let out a terrified, high-pitched whimper and buried his face deep into the fabric of her coat, his small body beginning to tremble uncontrollably. The sound, so full of pure, childish terror, finally broke through the shell of Ilara's shock. She was still his mother. She had to do something. She had to lie. "It's okay, sweetie. It just needs a really big spring cleaning, that's all." The words felt like stones in her mouth, a pathetic and transparent falsehood. She wrapped an arm around him, pulling him tight against her, feeling the frantic thumping of his little heart against her ribs. An ache of profound self-loathing spread through her chest, so sharp it was hard to breathe. She had promised him a castle, an adventure, and she had brought him here to this dark, rotting place that felt like it had been lifted directly from one of his nightmares. The performance of motherhood was over. She was a failure, exposed and raw in the cold, dead air of the tomb she had bought for them. Forcing a deep breath of the tainted air, she led Leo by the hand away from the catastrophic entryway and into an adjoining room. It must have once been a parlor. The shapes of furniture were still visible beneath heavy, dust-caked shrouds, making them look like a silent congregation of ghosts. Her foot snagged on the edge of a rotted carpet, and she nearly fell, catching herself on the cold, grimy surface of a shrouded table. They moved through the ground floor like trespassers in a forgotten world. The dining room held a long table covered in a thick layer of grime and bird droppings that had fallen from a smaller hole in the ceiling. In the kitchen, the rusted, skeletal remains of an ancient wood-burning stove sat amid a floor littered with shattered pottery. The sight of a small, mummified rat in the corner sent a fresh wave of revulsion through her. This place wasn't just abandoned. It felt cursed, actively rejecting any notion of life or warmth. It was a hollowed-out shell, and they were trapped inside it. Ilara's strength finally gave out. She sank onto the bottom step of the grand, sweeping staircase, heedless of the thick dust that puffed up around her. The wood beneath her felt damp and spongy, as if it might give way at any moment. This was it, the true bottom. The apartment, with its eviction notice and cold radiators, seemed like a paradise compared to this. There they had been poor. Here they were castaways, marooned in a sea of decay with no money, no working vehicle, no electricity, and no clean water. The cold from the stone floor began to seep into her bones, a deep, pervasive chill that mirrored the ice forming around her heart. She stared into the oppressive darkness of the hallway ahead, a blackness so complete it seemed to have physical substance. Silent tears began to trace paths through the grime on her cheeks. They weren't tears of grief or anger anymore. They were tears of pure, bottomless despair. There was no way out. She had walked them right into their grave. She pulled Leo onto her lap, wrapping her arms around him in a fierce, protective embrace that was as much for her own comfort as it was for his. He was shivering, his small body tense with fear. She buried her face in his hair, inhaling the faint, familiar scent of him, the only clean, good thing in this world of rot. The insane, desperate gamble had failed. She had bet their last dollar on a ghost of a chance, and the house had called her bluff. Blackwood Manor wasn't a shelter. It was a sarcophagus. As the last of the weak afternoon light died in the gaping hole above them, the interior of the house was plunged into an almost absolute darkness. The shadows deepened, coalescing into menacing shapes in the corners of her vision. In that moment, Ilara felt the last of her fight, the stubborn, desperate will to survive that had powered her for weeks, simply snap. It didn't fade. It shattered, leaving behind a vast, hollow emptiness. There was no next step. There was only the cold, the dark, and the crushing silence of the tomb. Days blurred into a haze of cold, exhausting labor. The first priority was to secure a single space against the encroaching decay, a small island of semi-livability in an ocean of ruin. Ilara decided on the main study. It was on the ground floor, and while its grand window was shattered, the stone walls seemed thicker, the ceiling blessedly intact. A massive, unadorned stone fireplace offered a flicker of hope for warmth. She and Leo spent an entire day dragging their few boxes into the room, their every movement echoing in the vast, hollow space. She felt a profound numbness settling over her, a survival mechanism that kept the full, crushing weight of their situation at bay. Her actions were robotic, driven by the primal animal instinct to shelter her young. The house groaned and settled around them, its wooden bones creaking a constant, mournful symphony. A sound that made the hairs on her arms stand up. Every drip of water from the ruined floors above was a tick of a clock counting down to their ultimate failure. The task of cleaning was Sisyphean. The dust was not merely a layer. It was a thick, fuzzy blanket that covered every surface, smelling of ages and secrets. It was a fine, grey powder that got into their throats and made them cough, a gritty reminder of the house's long neglect. Ilara used a torn piece of her own shirt, dampened with the last of their bottled water, to wipe down a small section of the floor. The rag came away black, and the floor underneath remained stubbornly filmed with grime. She could feel the dampness of the stone seeping up through the soles of her shoes, a relentless chill that no amount of work could warm. Leo, trying to be brave, attempted to sweep with a broken broom he'd found, but he mostly just stirred the dust into choking clouds that swirled in the weak light filtering through the broken window. A profound sense of futility washed over Ilara. It felt like trying to empty the ocean with a thimble. The house was too big, too broken, its decay too absolute. They worked until their muscles ached and their hands were raw. Ilara's stomach was a hollow, aching void, a constant, gnawing pain that she tried to ignore by focusing on the repetitive motion of scrubbing a small patch of floor. She gave Leo the last of their crackers, watching him eat with a fierce, painful love that tightened her chest. His face was smudged with dirt, his eyes wide and uncertain in the gathering gloom. As evening approached, the temperature in the study plummeted. The cold was a physical entity, a creeping predator that stole the warmth from their bodies. Clara managed to gather some splinters of dry-looking wood from a collapsed bookshelf in the hall, but the flint and steel she'd found in an old emergency kit only produced useless sparks. The wood was too damp. The chimney was likely blocked, defeated. She felt the last of her energy drain away, leaving her cold and empty. They were trapped in a stone refrigerator, and the night was just beginning. They huddled together on the cleanest patch of floor, wrapped in their one thin blanket. The cold was relentless. Ilara held Leo tightly, trying to warm him with her own body, but she was shivering too. The silence of the manor pressed in, broken only by the whisper of the wind through the shattered window and the faint, unnerving skittering sounds from within the walls. Rats. Her skin crawled. She closed her eyes, trying to block out the terror that was rising in her throat like bile. This was not an adventure. This was a slow death. Leo, restless and unable to sleep, squirmed out of her embrace. He was a bundle of nervous energy, a child's natural curiosity, fighting against the oppressive fear of their surroundings. Ilara watched him through heavy-lidded eyes, too exhausted to move. He began to wander the perimeter of the vast, shadowy room, his small fingers tracing patterns in the thick dust on the furniture shrouds, his soft footsteps a fragile sound in the immense quiet. "Mom," Leo's voice cut through her weary trance, a sharp note of surprise. "This one's not dirty." Ilara forced her head up. He was standing before a towering, built-in mahogany bookshelf that took up nearly an entire wall. It was a monstrous piece of furniture, dark and imposing, filled with the sagging spines of rotting books. But he was right. She squinted through the gloom. While the rest of the unit was draped in cobwebs and coated in a thick layer of grey dust, one central section, about 3 feet wide, was different. The wood there seemed to have a faint, deep luster, its polished surface drinking in what little light there was. It was clean, impossibly clean. Her tired mind struggled to process the incongruity. It made no sense. It was a single perfect square of order in a world of absolute chaos. A cold jolt, unrelated to the room's temperature, shot through her. It was the feeling of a pattern being broken, a detail that didn't belong. She pushed herself to her feet, her joints protesting with a chorus of creaks and aches. She crossed the room, her heart beginning to beat a little faster. Standing next to Leo, she ran her own fingers over the clean section. The wood was smooth, cool, and utterly free of dust, unlike the grimy shelves on either side. It felt like silk under her fingertips. Someone had been tending to this recently. The thought sent a fresh wave of fear through her. Were they not alone? But the fear was quickly replaced by a different sensation, a sharp, focused curiosity she hadn't felt since her days in the library. This was a puzzle. She leaned closer, her eyes scanning every inch of the polished wood. The craftsmanship was exquisite. The section was framed by intricate carvings of twisting vines and leaves, but in the very center of the top panel was a small, detailed carving of a raven, its obsidian eye seeming to stare right at her. Leo, with the impulsive, direct logic of a child, reached up on his tiptoes. "Maybe it's a button," he whispered, his voice filled with the hushed excitement of a secret. Before Ilara could stop him, he pushed his small thumb firmly into the center of the carved raven. For a heart-stopping second, nothing happened. Then, a sound shattered the silence of the room, a sharp, mechanical click. It was not a sound of wood or stone. It was the clean, precise sound of a well-oiled metal latch. It was so loud, so alien in the dead quiet of the manor, that they both flinched back with a shared gasp. Ilara's heart, which had been beating a slow, weary rhythm, suddenly kicked into a frantic gallop. She stared at the raven, her breath held tight in her chest. The silence that followed the click was even more profound, a heavy, expectant void waiting to be filled. The house seemed to be holding its breath right along with them. Slowly, cautiously, she reached out a trembling hand. The raven ornament had depressed slightly into the wood, and where its carved eye had been, there was now a small, perfectly round hole, rimmed with the dull glint of aged brass. A keyhole. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. Her stomach swooped, and for a moment the room tilted around her. This wasn't just a bookshelf. It was a door. It was a secret. The fear that had been her constant companion for weeks was suddenly burned away by a new, powerful emotion. A wild, desperate hope that was so intense it was almost painful. A shiver coursed down her spine. But this time it was not from the cold. It was the thrill of discovery, the intoxicating pull of a mystery that promised something other than despair. The keyhole was a question, a dare, and she felt an overwhelming compulsion to find the answer. The search began with a frenetic, silent urgency. A lock implied a key. A secret lock implied a secret key. Ilara's mind, suddenly sharp and clear, raced through the possibilities. Where would a reclusive academic, a man who built a secret door into his study, hide the key? not somewhere obvious. It would be part of the puzzle. She felt a surge of adrenaline, a warmth spreading through her limbs that had nothing to do with a fire. The gnawing hunger and the bone-deep cold were forgotten, pushed aside by this new, singular purpose. She moved through the study with new-found energy, her hands skimming over every surface. She ran her fingers along the underside of the massive desk, feeling for a taped envelope or a hidden drawer. She lifted the rotting cushions of a chaise lounge, ignoring the cloud of dust and the scent of mildew. She knelt on the cold stone floor, tapping the flagstones around the bookshelf, listening for a hollow sound. Her initial burst of energy began to wane, replaced by a growing frustration. The study was vast, filled with countless potential hiding places. Nothing. She found only more dust, more decay, more evidence of the ruin that had consumed her hope. She felt the despair beginning to creep back in at the edges of her mind. What if the key was long gone? Lost decades ago? What if this was just another dead end, another cruel trick played by the house? She leaned against the cold mahogany of the bookshelf, her forehead pressed against the wood, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She felt Leo's small hand slide into hers. He looked up at her, his eyes full of trust. "We'll find it, Mum," he said, his voice a small anchor in her sea of rising panic. His simple faith was a tonic. She had to find it. She couldn't let this be another failure. She couldn't disappoint him again. She took a deep breath and forced herself to think, not like a desperate woman, but like a librarian, like a scholar. The man who built this was Alistair Blackwood, an academic. The lock was a raven, the famous poem, by Edgar Allan Poe. Her eyes shot to the shelves. The room was filled with his works. Of course, it was a literary puzzle. The answer wasn't under the floor or behind a stone. It was hidden in plain sight, in the one place a book lover would think to look. The key would be inside a book. It was so simple, so elegant, that she almost laughed. A giddy, slightly hysterical sound escaped her lips. Her gaze flew across the rotting spines, searching, scanning. Which one? It had to be significant. A clue within a clue. Her mind raced through Poe's bibliography, her old professional knowledge surging to the forefront. Her eyes landed on a specific volume, not on the secret panel, but on an adjacent shelf. It was a thick, leather-bound collection, its title still faintly legible in tarnished gold leaf. Tales of the Grotesque and Arabesque. It was Poe's first collection of short stories, a seminal work, a beginning. It felt right. A current of certainty, electric and undeniable, coursed through her. With a hand that shook with anticipation, she pulled the heavy book from the shelf. It was heavier than it should be, its balance strangely off. She held her breath and carefully opened the cover. The first few pages were real, yellowed and brittle with age. But then, her fingers found the edge of a deep, precisely cut cavity carved into the center of the book's pages, and nestled within that hollow, resting on a bed of faded black velvet, was the key. It was not small or delicate. It was huge, heavy and black, forged from ornate iron, its head shaped like a complex knot. She lifted it out. Its cold, solid weight in her palm was the most real thing she had felt in months. She returned to the secret panel, the iron key clutched in her hand like a sacred relic. Her heart was a frantic drum against her ribs. Leo stood beside her, his eyes wide as saucers, his breathing shallow. The air in the room felt thick, charged with static electricity. She lifted the key, her hand shaking so violently that she struggled for a moment to guide its tip into the small, dark keyhole. The sound of the iron scraping against the brass surround was grating, a metallic shriek in the profound silence. She took a steadying breath, the cool, musty air filling her lungs, and pushed the key all the way in. It fit perfectly, with both hands wrapped around its head for leverage. She summoned all her strength and turned. There was a moment of stiff resistance, and then a deep groaning shudder echoed from within the wall. It was the sound of powerful, ancient gears grinding against the rust of decades, a low, guttural protest from the heart of the house. She pushed harder, her muscles straining. A series of loud, sequential thunks reverberated through the wood, like the tumblers of a giant's lock falling into place. For a terrifying second, nothing more happened. Ilara's heart sank. Had she broken it? The hope that had soared so high moments before crashed, leaving a bitter taste of disappointment in her mouth. She stared at the immovable bookshelf, feeling the familiar sting of tears pricking at her eyes. It had been too good to be true. Of course it had. But then, with a low, deep moan that seemed to emanate from the very foundations of the manor, the entire 3-foot section of the bookshelf began to move. It didn't swing open like a simple door. It smoothly, silently, impossibly, receded an inch into the wall and then slid sideways, disappearing into a hidden cavity. The engineering was brilliant, silent, and utterly mystifying. It revealed not a dusty closet or a stone wall, but a yawning rectangle of perfect, impenetrable darkness. It was an opening, a passage, leading into the unknown guts of the house. The air that breathed out from the blackness to meet them was the biggest shock of all. It wasn't the foul, damp, miasmic air of the manor. It was cool, clean, and utterly dry, carrying the faintest, most pleasant scent of aged paper, leather, and cedar. The stark contrast between the air of the manor and the air from the passage was dizzying. One was the breath of a corpse, the other of a sanctuary. A new, more complex fear seized her. This wasn't the fear of decay or starvation. This was the primal fairy tale fear of crossing a threshold into another world, a place that operated by a different set of rules. The blackness was absolute, a solid void that her eyes could not penetrate. It was both terrifying and magnetically alluring. What kind of man builds a tomb for himself and then hides a perfect, living world inside it? The question hammered in her mind, drowning out all other thoughts. She knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that she had to find out. This secret was now her secret, and its pull was irresistible. "Stay right here, Leo. Don't move," she commanded, her voice a low, firm whisper she barely recognized as her own. She would not risk him until she knew what lay beyond. Pulling her phone from her pocket, she winced at the low battery warning before turning on its weak flashlight. The beam cut a fragile, trembling cone into the darkness, revealing that the passage was short, maybe 10 feet long, and lined not with rough stone, but with smooth, polished wood panels. It was a finished hallway, not a crawl space. Taking a shaky breath that did little to calm the wild fluttering in her chest, she took the first step over the threshold. The floor beneath her foot was solid wood, not stone. She had crossed the line. There was no going back now. The air was so still she could hear the blood rushing in her ears. As she moved slowly down the short hall, her weak light beam danced over the walls, illuminating the perfect joinery of the wood panels. It was pristine, not a speck of dust, not a hint of dampness. Near the end of the passage, her light fell upon a small, incongruous object on the wall, a modern, brass-plated light switch. The anachronism was jarring. A hidden 19th-century bookshelf door and a 20th-century electrical switch. It made no sense. Her curiosity overwhelming her fear, she reached out a trembling finger. The switch felt solid, real. With a decisive flick, she pushed it up. A soft click echoed in the confined space, and in the next instant, the world exploded into light. It wasn't a single, harsh bulb. It was a warm, brilliant, gallery-quality light, emanating from fixtures cleverly hidden within a coffered ceiling. Ilara gasped, her hand flying to her mouth as her eyes struggled to adjust. She was standing at the entrance of a room so magnificent, so impossible, it stole the air from her lungs. It was a library, a secret, 2-story library, circular in shape, with walls lined from floor to ceiling with thousands upon thousands of immaculate, leather-bound books. A gracefully spiraling black iron staircase led to a second-floor mezzanine that ringed the upper level. In the center of the room, on a plush oriental rug, sat a massive and carved wooden desk and a deep leather armchair. It was a scholar's paradise. It was a dragon's hoard. It was a miracle hidden in the heart of a nightmare. She stepped fully into the room, her worn-out sneakers silent on the thick, luxurious rug. A soft, almost imperceptible hum vibrated in the air, the sound of a climate control system diligently fighting off the decay that consumed the rest of the house. The air smelled heavenly, the rich, complex perfume of old leather, acid-free paper and wood polish. She felt a dizzying, exhilarating wave of vertigo, as if she had stepped out of the grim reality of her life and into the pages of a fantasy novel. This room was a defiance of entropy, a testament to one man's obsession. She walked slowly, a trespasser in a sacred space, her ragged clothes and grimy skin a stark contrast to the room's utter perfection. Her gaze drifted over the shelves, her heart pounding with a librarian's reverence. This wasn't just a collection, it was a curated masterpiece. Her trained eye scanned the spines, and her breath caught in her throat. She recognized the publishers, the bindings, the distinctive gilt lettering. These were not just old books, they were first editions, in pristine condition. Her hand, shaking, reached out and gently traced the title on a slim volume. Tamerlane and Other Poems. Poe's first book, one of the rarest items in American literature. She knew, instantly, that she was standing in a room whose contents were worth a fortune, not just a small fortune, a life-altering, history-making fortune. She stumbled backward, her legs suddenly weak, and leaned against a shelf for support. The sheer scale of the discovery was too much to comprehend. It was a treasure beyond her wildest, most desperate dreams. This room was their salvation. Her eyes, wide with shock, swept across the space, taking in every impossible detail. On the great desk, under a soft spotlight of its own, was a curated display. A velvet-lined tray held a stack of letters, tied with a faded ribbon. She leaned over, her breath fogging the air. The handwriting was an elegant, slightly frantic script from the 19th century. Her gaze fell to the signature at the bottom of the top letter, and a small, strangled sound escaped her throat. Edgar Allan Poe. She was looking at personal correspondence from the master of the macabre himself, and next to the letters, lying open on a small wooden stand, was a bound manuscript, its pages filled with that same iconic script. The title on the cover page was one she had never seen before, A Lost Work. It was a literary holy grail. This was real. It was all real. Tears of pure, unadulterated shock began to stream down her face, silent rivers carving paths through the grime on her cheeks. These weren't tears of sorrow or despair. They were tears of disbelief and of a sudden, violent hope that was so powerful it physically hurt. This was the answer to everything. The eviction, the debt, the gnawing hunger, the terrifying future. It was all erased by the contents of this one, impossible room. This was more than just a roof over their heads. This was security. This was freedom. It was a future for Leo, a future she had thought was stolen from them forever. She sank into the supple leather of the desk chair, her body trembling with the aftershocks of the revelation. They were saved, but her relief was tinged with a new, unsettling question. Why go to such lengths? Why hide this treasure so completely? Her gaze fell upon another book on the desk, set apart from the priceless Poe artifacts. It was a thick, unadorned journal, bound in simple, sturdy brown leather. It looked much newer than the other items, perhaps from the mid to late 20th century. She reached for it with a sense of trepidation. This felt different. This was personal. She opened it to the first page. Written in a neat, disciplined cursive was an inscription, "The property of Alistair Blackwood," a chronicle of the Thorn deception, the name of the manor's last owner, and a title that sent a new, cold shiver down her spine. Deception. This wasn't just a collection. It was evidence. Her mind was spinning, struggling to connect the dots. The treasure, the secrecy, the diary. A terrifying premonition began to form, a shadow falling over her newfound joy. This room wasn't just about preserving a fortune, it was about protecting a secret. With trembling fingers, she pulled out her phone, noticing she had a single, weak bar of service in this part of the house. She quickly typed a search. Alistair Blackwood, Blackwood Manor. The results were sparse. A recluse, an academic, died of a sudden heart attack. Then she typed, "Rare Poe manuscript discovered value." The numbers that filled the small screen were staggering, incomprehensible. 7 figures, 8 figures. The phone slipped from her nerveless fingers and clattered onto the polished wooden floor, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the perfect silence. She had found a treasure that could save her family, but as she stared at the diary, she knew, with chilling certainty, that she had also stumbled upon a truth that someone had already killed to protect. The secret library was a bubble of impossible perfection, but the chill of the manor had followed her inside. It was a different kind of cold now, not the damp of decay, but the icy dread of a truth that was far more dangerous. Her fingers, trembling, traced the embossed title on the leather-bound journal, A Chronicle of the Thorn Deception. The name felt like a curse whispered in the hallowed silence. Every instinct, honed by years of quiet observation as a librarian, screamed that this was the heart of the mystery. The Poe collection was the vault, but this diary was the key. She could feel the pulse of a long-dead man's obsession radiating from the pages, a cold fury preserved in ink. Taking a deep, shuddering breath of the clean, dry air, she opened the cover. The world she knew, a world of simple poverty and grief, was about to be obliterated, replaced by a conspiracy that had festered in the town's heart for a century. The ghosts of this house were not in the halls, they were in the history. The first page was dated nearly 40 years prior. The handwriting was not the frantic scrawl of a madman, but the precise, controlled script of a scholar burning with a righteous, patient fire. Alistair Blackwood began not with himself, but with the town's founding father, Jeremiah Thorn. He dismantled the heroic bronze statue in the town square word by word, replacing the myth of a pioneering visionary with the stark reality of a predator. Ilara read of Thorn's arrival in the early 1900s, not as a man with a dream, but as a wolf cloaked in the sheep's clothing of legal expertise. Blackwood's prose was chillingly academic, each sentence a carefully laid stone in a damning indictment. The diary didn't scream, it testified. Ilara felt her stomach tighten. She had stumbled from a story of personal ruin into an epic of calculated, generational theft, and she was standing at its hidden epicenter, the air growing thinner with every word she read. The scheme was both simple and diabolical. Blackwood's research, detailed with meticulous footnotes and cross-references to public records, painted a devastating picture. Jeremiah Thorn had specifically targeted the waves of poor immigrant families arriving with little more than hope and the clothes on their backs. They were German, Polish, and Irish homesteaders, drawn by the promise of fertile, unclaimed land. They spoke little English and possessed a deep, often misplaced trust in authority and official-looking documents. They saw Thorn, with his tailored suit and smooth talk, as a guide who could help them navigate the bewildering American bureaucracy. They had no idea he was the architect of their downfall, a man who saw their hopeful, trusting faces and saw only profit. Ilara felt a wave of nausea. The pattern was timeless, the powerful preying on the vulnerable, a story she now knew by heart. The mechanism of the crime was the law itself, twisted into a weapon. Thorn, a lawyer by trade, would offer to file their land claims and deeds for a nominal fee. He would present them with stacks of papers filled with dense legalese they couldn't possibly comprehend. Buried within the jargon were clauses that transferred ownership to one of his shell corporations or assigned him power of attorney. The families would sign with an XR, believing they were securing their future, when in reality they were signing it away. The diary quoted a court clerk from 1908. He held their hands to guide the pen, like a father teaching a child to write its name. The image was so profoundly cynical, it made Ilara's blood run cold. This wasn't just grift. It was a violation of the most fundamental human dream of having a place to call one's own, a safe harbor in a new world. The ink of his pen was poison. Alistair Blackwood's connection was not academic. It was written in his blood. His great-grandparents, the Schwartz family from Bavaria, were among the first to fall victim. The diary included a faded photograph of them, a stern-faced couple with 4 small children, standing proudly before a half-built log cabin on land that Jiaotai, according to Blackwood's research, was the most fertile in the entire valley. Thorn had swindled them out of it for the price of a forged signature. That very land later became the town's commercial center, the foundation of the Thorn family's immense fortune. The diary chronicled the Schwartz family's subsequent collapse, a descent into tenant farming, poverty, and despair, their American dream turning to dust. Ilara looked at Leo, sleeping soundly on the priceless rug, and felt a fierce, protective rage. She saw her own son's precarious future reflected in the faces of those long-dead children in the photograph. The secret library, Ilara now understood, was an act of rebellion. It was the culmination of Alistair Blackwood's entire life. Haunted by his family's story, he had become a recluse, a ghost in his own rotting manor, dedicating every waking hour to his singular, secret crusade. He became a leading expert in historical document authentication, a skill he used to hunt down the original Spanish land grants and homesteading deeds that predated Thorne's fraud. He spent decades and a significant family inheritance scouring archives, private collections, and courthouse basements, slowly, painstakingly reassembling the puzzle of Jeremiah Thorne's crimes. The library was his war room. The Poe collection wasn't just a passion, it was his cover, the perfect camouflage for a man who needed the world to believe he was just an eccentric book collector, not an avenging angel of history. Blackwood knew he was fighting a dynasty. The diary spoke of the modern Thorne family, their power woven into the very fabric of the town's politics and economy. He wrote of his paranoia, a constant feeling of being watched, of files going missing from the town clerk's office, of accidents that befell other researchers who got too close. This was why he could not simply walk into a police station. He needed a case that was absolute, undeniable, and protected. He had begun hiding the most crucial pieces of evidence, the original deeds, Thorne's forged papers, sworn affidavits from other victims' descendants, within the priceless books themselves. A deed was folded and sewn into the binding of the gold bug. A confession letter was hidden within a hollowed-out copy of the purloined letter. The treasure and the evidence were inextricably linked, a brilliant strategy to ensure that anyone who sought one would inevitably find the other. A sound ripped through the profound silence of the manor, so alien and intrusive that Elara physically flinched. It was the deep, confident purr of an expensive car engine growing steadily closer. It was not the rattling groan of an old truck. This was a sound of wealth and power, and it was coming up their driveway. Elara's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. Panic, cold and sharp, sliced through her. She slammed the diary shut, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the still air. Who was out there? No one knew they were here. No one should be coming. She scrambled to her feet, her mind racing. The car stopped directly in front of the house, its engine cutting out with a soft, final sigh. The silence that rushed back in was heavier now, filled with a terrifying, immediate threat. Her sanctuary had been breached. "Leo, wake up," she whispered urgently, shaking his shoulder. The boy stirred, his eyes blinking open in confusion. "You need to hide, right now, behind the big desk. Do not make a sound, no matter what you hear. Do you understand me?" The terror in her voice was enough. He nodded, his face pale, and scrambled behind the massive desk at the far end of the secret room. As heavy, determined footsteps crunched on the gravel outside and then mounted the crumbling stone steps, Elara's hands trembled. She pushed the massive bookshelf, her muscles straining. It slid smoothly back into place, sealing the library once more. She left it open a fraction of an inch, a tiny vertical slit that gave her a sliver of a view into the study. Her breath caught in her throat, held tight in a knot of pure fear. The front door of the manor groaned open. Through the narrow crack, she saw him. A man stepped into the ruin of the grand entryway, silhouetted for a moment against the grey afternoon light. He was in his late 60s, with a full head of perfectly styled silver hair and a tailored charcoal suit that seemed to repel the dust and decay around him. He moved with an unhurried grace, his polished shoes navigating the debris with the casual confidence of a man surveying his domain. His eyes, cold and assessing, swept over the collapsed ceiling and mold-streaked walls, not with shock, but with a flicker of something that looked like impatient annoyance. He was not a visitor, he was an inspector, and as he turned his head, his sharp patrician features clicked into place with a horrifying certainty in Elara's mind. This had to be him, a Thorne. "Hello?" he called out. His voice was smooth as velvet, but it filled the cavernous space with an undeniable authority. "Mrs. Vance? Are you here?" The sound sent a jolt of ice water through Elara's veins. He knew her name. He knew she was here. The $1 sale. The bizarre listing. It was all a trap. He had been waiting for someone to take the bait. Forcing her legs to move, she took a deep breath and stepped out from the shadows of the study, trying to arrange her face into a mask of weary confusion. She wiped her dusty hands on her jeans, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her breastbone. She felt like a mouse stepping out of its hole to face a hawk. The man's gaze locked onto hers, and a thin, professional smile spread across his lips. "Ah, there you are, Marcus Thorne. I apologize for the intrusion. I wanted to personally welcome you to Blackwood Manor." Ilara's throat was as dry as dust. "Mr. Thorne," she managed, her own voice sounding thin and weak. "You're the developer." Her mind was screaming. The Thorne deception. This man's family had built their empire on stolen land and shattered lives, and here he was, standing in the wreckage of his one loose end. "That's right," he said, his smile never wavering. "My family has deep roots in this town. We feel a certain responsibility for this place." He gestured around at the ruin. "Which is why I'm here. Frankly, this property is a liability, not a home. As a charitable gesture and to help a family in need, my firm would be willing to buy the deed back from you. Let's say $10,000 for your time and trouble." He said it so casually, as if the money meant nothing, as if he were doing her the grandest of favors. The offer hung in the air, a beautiful, tempting poison. $10,000. A week ago, that sum would have been a lifeboat, a miracle. She could take it, grab Leo and disappear, find a small apartment somewhere far away, safe and anonymous. But as she looked at Marcus Thorne's placid, smiling face, she saw the ghost of his ancestor, Jeremiah, holding the pen for her great-grandparents. She heard the silent screams of the families whose dreams were turned to nightmares on this very land. The weight of the diary of Alistair Blackwood's 40-year quest settled on her shoulders. This was not just her fight anymore. The word came out before she could even think, a single, quiet syllable of defiance. "No," she cleared her throat, finding a strength she didn't know she possessed. "No. Thank you, Mr. Thorne. We're staying. This is our home now." The smile on Marcus Thorne's face didn't just fade, it evaporated. The change was instantaneous and terrifying. The mask of the benevolent patriarch fell away, revealing the cold, predatory lizard beneath. His eyes, which had been professionally pleasant, turned to chips of flint. He took a deliberate step closer, invading her personal space, his expensive cologne suddenly suffocating. His voice dropped to a low, conspiratorial murmur, a sound that was far more menacing than a shout. "A single mother," he mused, his gaze flicking toward the shadows where Leo was hidden from his sight, "and a young boy, all alone out here." His eyes drifted up to the gaping hole in the roof, then to the damp, crumbling walls. Such an old, unsafe building, a real tinderbox, full of black mold, I hear. So many things can go wrong. He paused, letting the silence stretch, his meaning hanging in the air like the thick, spore-filled dust. "Unfortunate accidents," he continued, his voice a silky, venomous whisper. "They happen all the time. It would be a terrible, terrible tragedy for a new family to have their story end here. A real shame." The threat was no longer veiled. It was a promise, delivered with the chilling confidence of a man who had made such things happen before. He held her gaze for one more second, a look of pure, cold dominance, and then he turned and walked away. The sound of his footsteps, crunching decisively on the plaster and broken glass, echoed in the ruin. Ilara stood frozen, her blood like ice in her veins, listening to the engine of his car start and then fade into the distance, leaving behind a silence more terrifying than any noise. The choice was clear. The money meant a safe escape. The secret meant a righteous war. What would you do in her place? Would you run for your child's life, or would you stay and fight for the ghosts of 100 years? The oppressive silence Marcus Thorne left behind was 1,000 times more terrifying than his words. It was a vacuum, pregnant with violence. Ilara stood frozen in the center of the dusty study, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird trying to shatter its cage. A cold sweat slicked her skin, and the fine hairs on her arms stood on end. The rich, suffocating scent of Thorne's cologne lingered in the stale air, a ghostly signature of his presence, a promise of his return. The floorboards above groaned, and she flinched, her eyes darting into the deepening shadows. Every sound the decaying manor made was no longer the house settling. It was him. It was his men. They were coming back. She could feel it in her bones, a primal, animal certainty that she was being hunted. The last vestiges of daylight were dying, and the thought of being trapped in this black-as isolated tomb when he returned sent a wave of pure, unadulterated panic through her, so powerful it made her knees weak and her vision swim in the gloom. The entire charade clicked into place with sickening clarity. The bizarre $1 sale, the lack of interior photos, the assumption that any destitute buyer would be easily scared away. It was all a meticulous, patient trap. Thorne hadn't wanted to buy the land. He wanted to legally seize it after its desperate, doomed owner fled or met with an unfortunate accident. He had engineered the entire scenario, using the town's own bureaucracy as a weapon, just as his ancestor Jeremiah had used the law. She was a pawn in a century-old game, a disposable piece he had intended to sweep off the board. The realization brought not just fear, but a surge of cold, clarifying anger. He had underestimated her. He had looked at her, a grieving widow with a child, and seen only a victim. He had no idea he had just threatened a woman who had spent her entire life finding answers hidden in forgotten texts. He had no idea she was now the custodian of Alistair Blackwood's righteous 40-year war. He had threatened the wrong librarian. The thought of flight was a brief, seductive whisper. Take Leo and run, disappear into the vast, anonymous expanse of the country. But where would they go? With $157 to their name, they would be homeless in a day, hunted by a man with limitless resources and no conscience. Running was a death sentence, just a slower one. The alternative was a terrifying, near-suicidal act of defiance. To stay, to fight, to use the truth Alistair Blackwood had died to protect. She looked toward the secret panel, her gaze piercing through the mahogany, as if she could see the diary resting on the desk inside. That book was not just a chronicle of injustice. It was a weapon. It was the only weapon she had. In that moment, a profound shift occurred deep within her. The terror didn't vanish, but it was joined by a grim, hard resolve that solidified in her gut. She would not be another one of Thorne's victims. She would not let her son's future be stolen. She was going to finish what Alistair Blackwood started. The house was a tomb, but a tomb was also a fortress. Her fear transmuted into frantic, purposeful energy. She slipped back into the hidden library, the clean, dry air, a shocking contrast to the miasma of fear she was breathing. She didn't have time to marvel at the Poe collection now. Its monetary value seemed abstract, almost meaningless compared to the life-or-death struggle she was in. She went straight to the desk and snatched up Alistair's diary. Her mind raced, sifting through the details she had skimmed. If Alistair was paranoid enough to build this sanctuary, he must have planned for the worst. He must have an escape route. Her fingers, slick with sweat, flew through the pages, her eyes scanning the neat cursive for any mention of the manor's architecture, its secrets, and then she found it. In a section detailing the house's original construction during Prohibition, he described a bootlegger's tunnel, built to move contraband. It began behind a false wall in the root cellar and emerged in the woods nearly half a mile away. Her heart leaped. It was a chance. She couldn't take everything. The Poe collection, the source of their potential fortune, would have to be sacrificed. It was too much, too bulky. What mattered was the proof, the story. With a librarian's desperate precision, she began to move through the shelves, her hands seeking out the specific books Alistair had mentioned in his diary as hiding places. She retrieved the original Spanish land grant folded inside, the gold bug and the sworn affidavit from a victim's descendant, tucked within the pages of the murders in the Rue Morgue. She worked quickly, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps, her ears straining for any sound from outside. She placed the documents and the diary into a worn leather satchel she found in the desk, its strap cracked with age. The bag was heavy, not just with paper, but with the weight of generations of injustice. It was the physical manifestation of 100 years of stolen dreams. She clutched it to her chest. This was their only hope for both justice and survival, a heavy burden for a desperate flight into the night. The decision was made. She would wait until the dead of night, the deepest point of darkness, and use the tunnel to escape to the woods. From there, she would try to find the farm of Alistair's only friend, the retired town clerk mentioned in the diary, Arthur Pendleton. It was a desperate plan, a thread of hope woven from whispers in a dead man's journal, but it was the only one she had. She gathered Leo, who was pale and silent, his eyes huge in the gloom. "We're going to play a new game," she whispered, her voice trembling despite her efforts to keep it steady. "A hiding game, the most important one ever." She led him back into the main study, leaving the secret library door slightly ajar, a silent witness to their plight. They huddled together behind the massive dust-shrouded desk, the satchel of evidence clutched between them. The minutes stretched into an eternity. The house groaned around them, and the wind howled through the shattered windows, each gust sounding like a predatory whisper. Time slowed to a crawl, every second thick with dread. The sound began as a low, distant rumble, a vibration felt more in the bones than heard with the ears. It was not Thorne's smooth, purring luxury car. This was a deeper, more guttural sound, the growl of a heavy-duty truck engine, laboring as it churned up the rutted, unpaved driveway. Ilara's blood ran cold. It was too soon. It wasn't even full dark yet. Her heart slammed against her ribs, a frantic, painful rhythm. She pulled Leo tighter, her hand clamped over his mouth to stifle any sound. The truck coughed to a stop directly in front of the house, its engine cutting out abruptly. The silence that followed was broken by the slam of two heavy vehicle doors and the crunch of boots on gravel. They were here. A cold, metallic taste of fear filled Ilara's mouth. Her plan to wait for darkness had evaporated. They were trapped. The hunters had arrived early, and the game she had just described to her son had suddenly become terrifyingly real, with the highest possible stakes. There was nowhere left to run. Then she smelled it. Faint at first, but sharp and unmistakable, cutting through the musty odor of decay, gasoline. Her stomach plummeted, and a wave of nausea so intense it made her dizzy washed over her. They weren't here to threaten her again. They weren't here to negotiate. They were here to erase the problem, to burn the house to the ground, to incinerate the secret library, the evidence, and anyone who happened to be inside. Thorne's words echoed in her mind. A real tinderbox. It hadn't been a threat. It had been a statement of intent. The boots were on the porch now, heavy and deliberate. A loud crash echoed through the house as they kicked the front door fully off its one remaining hinge. "Nobody here," a rough voice grunted, the sound chillingly close. "Let's get this done. Boss wants it gone by sunrise." Her carefully constructed resolve shattered into a million pieces of pure, primal terror. This was it. They were going to die here, consumed by fire in a forgotten house. Panic gave way to a desperate, animalistic instinct to survive. There was no time to think, only to act. "Leo, listen to me," she whispered, her voice raspy with terror. "We have to go. Now. Hold my hand and don't let go, no matter what." She grabbed the satchel, slinging the strap over her shoulder. Peeking around the edge of the desk, she saw the silhouettes of two large men moving through the grand entryway, their forms distorted by the gloom. They were carrying large plastic cans. They began to splash liquid everywhere, the sharp, volatile scent of the gasoline instantly intensifying, burning her nostrils and making her eyes water. The sound was a horrifying desecration, the accelerant soaking into the ancient dry wood and tattered fabrics. The house, which had been slowly succumbing to a natural decay over a century, was about to be murdered in a matter of minutes. She had to move. Now. Before the first spark was struck, the tunnel was their only path. Holding Leo's cold, trembling hand in a death grip, she crept from behind the desk, using the deep shadows and the shrouded furniture as cover. Every creak of the floorboards under her feet sounded like a cannon shot. The men were in the adjoining parlor, their voices gruff and indistinct as they continued their work. Ilara's destination was the kitchen, at the far back of the house, where the diary had indicated the cellar door was located. It felt a world away. She moved in a low crouch, pulling a terrified but silent Leo along with her. They navigated a maze of ghostly, shrouded shapes, the air growing thick and heavy with gasoline fumes. The smell was suffocating, a promise of the inferno to come. Her lungs burned. A window shattered in the dining room, the sound of breaking glass sharp and violent, followed by a gust of wind that swirled the flammable vapors through the house. They were making sure the fire would have plenty of air. A funeral pyre. For her and her son. They reached the kitchen doorway. The room was a wreck of rusted metal and shattered pottery, even darker than the rest of the ground floor. The cellar door, according to the diary's crude map, should be against the far wall. The men's voices were louder now, just one room over. "That's the last of it. Get the rags ready." Fear, sharp and electrifying, shot through Ilara. They were seconds away from igniting the blaze. She pulled Leo into the pitch-black kitchen, her free hand sweeping frantically along the cold, damp plaster of the far wall. Her fingers snagged on splintered wood, then found the cold, round shape of an iron knob. The cellar door. It was low to the ground, almost a hatch. She pulled on it with all her might. It resisted. The wood swollen with a century of damp. For one heart-stopping moment, she thought it was fused shut. Tears of frustration and terror stung her eyes. She gave one last, desperate heave, putting her entire body weight into it. With a low groan of protest, the door scraped open. A wave of cold, earthy air washed over them, thick with the smell of damp soil and subterranean rot. The darkness below was absolute, a blackness so complete it felt like a solid wall. She could hear the frantic scuttling of unseen things in the depths, but the sounds from above were far more terrifying. "Ready!" one of the men called out. "Light it up!" There was no more time. Pushing Leo ahead of her into the yawning black hole, Ilara didn't hesitate. She swung her legs into the opening and tumbled down a short and steep flight of rickety wooden stairs, landing hard on the damp earth floor below. The satchel slammed against her hip, a painful reminder of its precious contents. She pulled the heavy cellar door shut above them, plunging them into a suffocating, total blackness. A fraction of a second later, a deep, terrifying whoosh sound echoed from above, a noise like a giant beast taking a sudden, fiery breath. The inferno had begun. A thin line of orange light appeared in the cracks around the cellar door. The air in the cellar was cold and thin, making each breath a struggle. Leo was whimpering, a high, terrified sound that she could feel more than hear in the pitch darkness. "Shh, baby, it's okay. We're okay," she whispered, the lie tasting like ash in her mouth. She fumbled for her phone, her fingers clumsy with adrenaline. The screen flared to life, its weak light a pathetic shield against the overwhelming blackness. The cellar was small, its stone walls slick with moisture. Piles of rotted wooden barrels lay in the corners, remnants of a bygone era. Above them, a low, rumbling roar was building, the sound of the fire consuming the house. The wooden stairs they had just descended were already beginning to smolder, smoke curling from between the planks. The heat was intensifying, pressing down from the ceiling. They had escaped the initial blaze, but they would be baked alive if they didn't find the tunnel entrance immediately. The cellar was not a sanctuary, it was an oven. The diary's description was burned into her memory. Behind the northernmost wine rack, the stone is false. There were no wine racks left, only the dark, skeletal remains of them against one wall. Her phone's trembling beam swept across the damp stone. The roar from above was deafening now, punctuated by the sharp crack of splitting timbers and the crash of collapsing sections of floor. The entire house was groaning, a great beast in its death throes. Clara pushed aside the rotted wood of a collapsed rack, her hands searching for a seam, a crack, anything that suggested a hidden door. Her fingers, raw and covered in grime, traced the mortar lines. Nothing. It was solid stone. Panic, cold and absolute, seized her. Had she been wrong? Was the diary a lie? The smoke was getting thicker, pouring down the stairs in a choking black cloud. Leo was coughing, his small body shaking. The heat was becoming unbearable. They were going to die. This was the end. Trapped in a stone box beneath a raging inferno. Then her fingers brushed against it. Not a seam, but a single stone that felt different. It was smoother, and it moved just a fraction of an inch under the pressure of her hand. "Push," the diary had said, "with all your might." Setting the phone down so its light pointed at the wall, Ilara placed both her hands and her shoulder against the stone and pushed. Nothing. It was immovable. Desperation gave her a surge of superhuman strength. She braced her feet on the slick earth floor and threw her entire body weight against the wall, a guttural cry of effort tearing from her raw throat. For a long second, nothing happened. Then, with a deep, grinding scrape of stone against stone, the entire section of the wall gave way. It didn't swing open but pivoted inward, revealing a narrow, black opening just large enough for a person to squeeze through. The air that wafted out was cool and ancient, the smell of undisturbed earth. They had found it. The tunnel, their last, desperate hope. She pushed Leo through the opening first, then scrambled in after him, dragging the precious satchel. The stone door swung shut behind them with a deep, final thud, sealing them in a darkness even more profound than that of the cellar. The roaring of the fire was instantly muffled, replaced by a tomb-like silence and the sound of their own frantic, ragged breathing. The air was cold and claustrophobic, heavy with the scent of wet clay and minerals. Ilara switched her phone light back on. They were in a narrow man-made tunnel, its walls rough-hewn dirt and rock, supported by rotting wooden beams every few feet. It was barely high enough for her to stand, and so narrow her shoulders brushed the damp earth on either side, it felt like being swallowed alive. A terrifying, claustrophobic nightmare. But it was a nightmare that led away from the fire. They had to keep moving. "Come on, sweetie," she urged, her voice echoing strangely in the confined space. "We have to keep going." The journey through the tunnel was a special kind of hell. The floor was uneven and slick with mud, and stagnant pools of icy water had collected in the low spots, soaking their shoes and chilling them to the bone. The darkness seemed to press in, alive and menacing, and the weak beam of her phone's flashlight only illuminated a few feet ahead, revealing scurrying insects and thick sand-pale roots that snaked down from the ceiling like grasping fingers. Leo, exhausted and terrified, stumbled frequently, his sobs the only sound besides their splashing footsteps and her own hammering heart. Ilara's phone battery was critically low, the icon blinking a malevolent red. The thought of being plunged into absolute blackness a quarter-mile underground was a terror she couldn't allow herself to contemplate. She focused on putting one foot in front of the other, pulling her son along, the weight of the satchel a constant, grounding presence against her side. It was a blind, desperate pilgrimage away from the fire and toward an unknown fate. After what felt like an eternity, she felt a change in the air, a faint, fresh current, carrying the scent of pine needles and night. Hope, sharp and painful, lanced through her. The tunnel began to slope upward. A few yards later, it ended abruptly in a solid wall of thick, gnarled roots. Panic flared for a moment before she saw it, a rickety wooden ladder leading up to a small patch of darkness that seemed less dense than the surrounding earth. It had to be the exit. She climbed the ladder, pushing with her head and shoulders against a heavy wooden hatch. It gave way with a shower of dirt and dead leaves, and she was hit by a blast of cold, clean night air. She pulled herself out, then reached down and hauled Leo up after her. They were free. They were standing in a thicket of ferns and bushes, deep within the woods. They were alive. They had escaped the inferno. The relief was so overwhelming it buckled her knees, and she collapsed onto the damp forest floor, gasping for breath. Behind them, through the skeletal silhouettes of the winter trees, the sky was no longer black. It was a pulsating, malevolent orange. A massive column of black smoke and glowing embers churned into the night, a volcanic eruption of destruction. The distant roar of the fire was a deep, constant, beastly growl. Blackwood Manor was gone. The secret library, the priceless Poe collection, the monument to Alistair's obsession. All of it was being turned to ash. A profound, aching sadness mixed with her relief. The fortune that could have saved them was gone. But as she clutched the heavy leather satchel to her chest, she knew she had saved the one thing that truly mattered. She hadn't saved the treasure. She had saved the truth. She had saved the ghosts. She had saved the story. The fire was not an ending. It was a beginning. It was the signal fire for a war that had just been declared, and she was its sole, terrified and determined soldier. She had the weapon in her hands. The heat from the distant blaze was a palpable wave against her back, a constant reminder of the death they had so narrowly escaped. The orange glow cast long, dancing shadows through the forest, making the familiar shapes of trees twist into monstrous, grasping figures. The woods, which had seemed menacing before, were now their only sanctuary. Ilara got to her feet, her body aching, her muscles trembling with exhaustion and adrenaline. She pulled Leo close, shielding his eyes from the horrifying spectacle of their former home being devoured by flames. "It's okay," she murmured, more to herself than to him. "It's just a house." But it wasn't just a house, it was a crime scene, an act of attempted murder, and the proof was in the satchel slung over her shoulder. The weight of it was immense, a burden and a blessing. Now, they had to complete their journey. They had to find Arthur Pendleton. They had to find the one person Alistair Blackwood had trusted in this world. Their lives depended on it. Using the hellish glow of the fire as a macabre compass, she tried to orient herself. The diary had said Arthur's farm was to the northwest of the manor. She stared into the dark woods, a wall of blackness that seemed to swallow the firelight just a few yards in. Every instinct screamed at her to stay put. to hide until dawn, but she knew Thorn would not be satisfied with just the fire. He would search for bodies. When he found none, he would start hunting them. They had to keep moving. They had to find Arthur before Thorn's men found them. With a deep breath that tasted of smoke and pine, she took Leo's hand. "We have to walk a little more, sweetie. We're going to find a friend." Her voice was steady, a fragile dam holding back a flood of terror. She plunged into the darkness, away from the fire, the satchel bumping against her hip with every step. They were fugitives now, running through the night, illuminated by the flames of their burning past, chasing a ghost's last hope. The forest was a terrifying labyrinth of unseen obstacles and unnerving sounds. Every snap of a twig underfoot was a footstep behind them. Every hoot of a distant owl was a signal between hunters. The cold seeped into their bones, a damp, penetrating chill that their thin jackets could not repel. Leo, running on pure adrenaline and fear, finally stumbled, his legs giving out. He was too exhausted to cry, his small body just trembling uncontrollably. Ilara's own strength was failing. Her lungs burned, her legs felt like lead, and the constant, gnawing fear was a physical weight. She knelt beside him, her heart aching. For a moment, despair washed over her. It was too much. The woods were too vast, the night too dark, their enemy too powerful. They were just one woman and one small boy against a dynasty built on violence. They were going to die out here, cold and alone. The fire behind them was a funeral pyre, and the woods would be their unmarked grave. This was a fool's errand. But then, through the dense tangle of trees, she saw it. A single, tiny, yellow light. It was faint, impossibly distant, but it was there. A light in the darkness. It was a pinprick of hope in an ocean of black despair. It had to be a house. It had to be Arthur's farm. A fresh surge of adrenaline, born not of fear, but of desperate hope, flooded her system. "Look, Leo," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Look, a light." She scooped him up into her arms. He was impossibly heavy, a dead weight of exhaustion, but she barely felt it. Her focus was entirely on that tiny, distant beacon. It was their North Star, their salvation. She began to move toward it, no longer stumbling, but with a renewed, desperate purpose. She crashed through underbrush, ignoring the branches that clawed at her face and clothes. The light was everything. It was safety. It was sanctuary. It was the end of this nightmare and the beginning of the fight for justice. She just had to reach it. She had to. The light grew steadily brighter, resolving itself into the warm, welcoming square of a farmhouse window. Soon, the dark, solid shape of a small house and a barn emerged from the gloom. They had made it. Sobbing with a mixture of relief and exhaustion, Ilara staggered out of the tree line and into a cleared field. She ran the last 100 yards, her lungs screaming, her legs threatening to buckle with every step. She reached the small wooden porch and practically fell against the front door, her free hand banging against the wood with a weak, frantic rhythm. The satchel slammed against the doorframe, a hollow, heavy sound. She could hear movement inside, then the sound of a bolt being drawn. The door creaked open a few inches, and a man's face appeared in the gap. He was old, his face a road map of deep wrinkles. His eyes, shielded behind thick glasses, were sharp and wary. A shotgun was held loosely but ready in his hands. "Who's there?" he demanded, his voice a gravelly, suspicious rasp. "Arthur Pendleton." Ilara gasped, her voice barely a whisper. She was out of breath, out of strength, out of everything except desperation. "My name is Ilara Vance. Alistair Blackwood. He sent me." At the mention of Alistair's name, the old man's entire demeanor shifted. The suspicion in his eyes was replaced by a look of profound, startled shock. His gaze dropped from her smoke-stained, scratched face to the exhausted child in her arms, and then to the hellish orange glow that was visible over the treetops behind her. He seemed to understand everything in that single, horrified glance. The gun lowered. The bolt slid back the rest of the way. "Dear God," he breathed, his voice filled with a dawning 40-year-old dread. He finally did it. The bastard finally did it. He opened the door wide, pulling her and Leo inside, out of the cold and into the warm, safe light of his home. The door closed, shutting out the night and the fire, and for the first time in an eternity, Ilara felt like she could finally breathe. The warmth of the small farmhouse was a physical shock. It was a cozy, cluttered space that smelled of wood smoke, old books, and brewing coffee. It was the scent of safety, of a life lived in quiet defiance. Arthur Pendleton, who looked to be in his late 80s, moved with a surprising quickness. He took a still shivering Leo from Ilara's arms and wrapped him in a thick, hand-knitted afghan before setting him gently on a worn sofa near the stone fireplace. Ilara's legs finally gave out, and she sank into a creaking rocking chair, the precious satchel still clutched in her lap. Her body was trembling with the aftershocks of adrenaline, a violent, uncontrollable shiver. Arthur pressed a steaming mug of coffee into her hands. The ceramic was hot, and the warmth seeped into her frozen fingers, a small but profound comfort. "Alistair," he said, his voice soft now, filled with a deep, ancient sadness. "He talked about you. Not you specifically, but someone like you. He always said someone would come. Someone who needed the house enough to find its heart." Ilara could only nod, her throat too tight to speak. She took a sip of the coffee, the hot liquid scalding but welcome. Arthur sat opposite her, his sharp eyes fixed on her face, then on the satchel. "That fire. That's the manor, isn't it? That's Thorne's work." It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact. A conclusion he had been waiting decades to finally reach. Ilara found her voice a raw, ragged whisper. "He came to the house. Marcus Thorne. He threatened us. He said accidents happen. Then his men came back. With gasoline." The story tumbled out of her in a frantic, disjointed flood. The secret library, the Poe collection, Alistair's diary, the evidence hidden in the books, the narrow escape through the tunnel as the house burned around them. She talked until her voice was gone, until the whole ugly, terrifying story lay between them in the warm, quiet room. Arthur listened without interruption, his expression growing grimmer with every word, his gnarled hands clenching into tight, white-knuckled fists on his knees. When she was finished, a heavy silence filled the room. Arthur stared into the fire, his eyes distant, lost in a memory from 40 years ago. "I was the town clerk," he said finally, his voice a low, bitter rumble. "I saw the paperwork. I saw what Jeremiah Thorne did, but the records were sealed. The judges were in his pocket. Alistair was the only one who had the courage to dig deeper." He looked at Ilara, his eyes shining with unshed tears. "He was my friend. He was a good man, a brilliant man, and they killed him." The words hung in the air, a final, damning confirmation of what Ilara had already suspected. "Oh, he called me the day before he died," Arthur continued, his voice trembling with a long-suppressed rage. He was ecstatic. He'd found the last piece of evidence he needed, the one that tied the land fraud directly to Marcus Thorne's current company. He had a meeting scheduled with a federal prosecutor in the city the next morning. He was finally ready to expose them all. Arthur leaned forward, his eyes boring into hers. He never made it to that meeting. He was found the next morning. A sudden, massive heart attack, the Thorne-appointed coroner called it. Alistair was 74, but he was fit as a fiddle. I never believed it. Not for a second. They murdered him to stop him from talking. They silenced him, and they thought they had buried his life's work forever. He gestured toward the satchel in her lap. But they didn't, did they? He was smarter than them. He left it all for you. The final, chilling piece of the puzzle slotted into place. This wasn't just about fraud and historical injustice anymore. It was about murder. Marcus Thorne was not just a ruthless developer protecting his family's legacy. He was a killer, and he had already tried to add 2 more names to his list of victims tonight. The fire wasn't just to destroy evidence, it was to eliminate the witnesses. The realization sent a fresh wave of ice-cold terror through Ilara, a fear more profound than anything she had felt in the burning house. She hadn't just escaped a fire, she had escaped her own execution. Arthur didn't panic. He had been waiting for a call like this for 40 years, a lifetime spent tending a cold hope. His face, a mask of grim resolve in the firelight, showed no fear, only the quiet, terrible certainty of a man whose worst suspicions had just been confirmed in a pillar of smoke and fire. He moved to an old rotary phone on a small wooden table, his steps steady. He dialed a number from memory, a number he had recited to himself in the dark for decades. Ilara listened, the satchel a lead weight in her lap, as his gravelly voice cut through the quiet room. "Sarah, it's Arthur Pendleton. Yes, it's been a long time. I have a story for you, a big one. The Thorne deception. It's all real, and I have the star witness sitting right here. There's been a fire. Attempted murder. I have the proof Alistair Blackwood died for." He paused, listening. "Yes," he said, his voice dropping. "The proof that can burn down an empire." The weight of those words settled in the air, the first shot in a war that had just begun. The response was not one of journalistic skepticism, but of immediate, decisive action. The voice on the other end, belonging to the journalist Sarah, was sharp and energized. The story Arthur laid out in stark, simple terms was not just a scoop, it was a bombshell, the kind of career-defining story a reporter dreams about. Arthur hung up the phone with a heavy, final click, the sound sealing Marcus Thorne's fate. He turned to Alara, his old eyes clear and focused. "Sarah's a senior investigative journalist at the Post. She's the best, and she believes us." He took a deep breath. "They're coming, not just her team. She's on a secure line with the Justice Department, federal marshals. They'll be here before sunrise to secure the property and take your testimony." A wave of disbelief washed over Alara, so potent it was dizzying. Federal marshals. The words sounded like they belonged in a movie, not in her shattered life. For the first time, a sound from the outside wasn't a threat. It was the distant, approaching wail of sirens, a sound not of menace, but of salvation. As the first grey light of dawn broke over the horizon, tinting the plume of smoke a sickly pink, they arrived. Not the local police, but a convoy of black, unmarked SUVs that rolled up the long dirt driveway with silent, professional competence. Men in dark tactical gear emerged, their movements economical and purposeful as they established a secure perimeter around Arthur's small farm. They were a wall of calm authority against the chaos of the night. One of them, a woman with kind but serious eyes, introduced herself as Marshal Davies. She spoke to Alara not as a hysterical victim, but as a key witness. With a reverence that surprised Alara, the Marshal took the heavy leather satchel. The transfer of the burden was a physical sensation, a crushing weight lifting from her shoulders. Sarah, the journalist, was with them, a woman in her 50s with an intelligent, compassionate gaze. As Alara began her story again, fueled by Arthur's strong coffee, her voice was no longer a whisper. It was the clear, steady voice of a survivor, ready to testify. The sun was barely over the trees when the convoy arrived at the gates of Marcus Thorne's sprawling estate. While the embers of Blackwood Manor still glowed, Thorne was in his sun-drenched breakfast room, clad in a silk robe, reading the financial news. He was a king in his castle, confident that his problem had been reduced to a pile of ash and a brief mention in the local police blotter. The crunch of tires on his perfectly raked gravel driveway was the first discordant note in his symphony of control. He looked up, annoyed, as the federal marshals streamed onto his property. There was no shouting, no drama. Marshal Davies approached him as he stood on his marble portico. "Marcus Thorne," she said, her voice calm and devoid of emotion, "you are under arrest for conspiracy, arson, and the attempted murder of Alara Vance and Leo Vance." His face, a mask of patrician arrogance, finally cracked, crumbling into a gargoyle of shock and disbelief as the cold, hard steel of the handcuffs clicked shut around his wrists. The sound a perfect echo of justice finally served. The story exploded onto the national stage. Sarah's front-page article, "The Thorne Deception, a Legacy of Fraud, a Night of Fire," was a masterpiece of investigative journalism, weaving together a century of crime with the harrowing tale of Alara's survival. Alistair Blackwood's meticulous diary, the irrefutable land deeds, and Arthur's corroborating testimony created a case so airtight it was a legal battering ram. The article went viral, a digital firestorm that eclipsed the one at the Manor. Soon, a team of human rights lawyers, specializing in historical land claims, descended on the town. They filed a massive class-action lawsuit representing the descendants of the dozens of families swindled by Jeremiah Thorne, families who had been scattered by poverty and time, but were now united by Alistair's work and Alara's courage. The lawsuit wasn't just about money. It was about rewriting history, about giving names and voices back to the ghosts who had been silenced for 100 years. Their quiet suffering finally brought into the light. The legend of the secret library, a treasure chamber of truth consumed by fire, captured the public's imagination. A prestigious university, whose archives specialized in 19th-century American literature, reached out to Ilara. They had read about the lost Poe manuscript and, with Thorne's assets frozen and the land now legally hers, they proposed a joint venture, a careful archaeological excavation of the manor's foundations. Ilara agreed. For weeks, a team worked, sifting through the ash and rubble of the collapsed study. Hopes were low, but the secret room, built by a paranoid genius, had one last miracle to offer. The climate control system had failed, but the room had been so perfectly sealed that it became a low-oxygen oven, charring but not incinerating its contents. And there, in the wreckage of the desk, they found it, the lost Poe manuscript. Its edges were blackened and brittle, but the ink, the story, the ghost of Poe's own hand, was miraculously, undeniably preserved. The treasure had survived the fire. The authentication process was a global event in the literary world. Experts flew in, confirming not only the lost manuscript, but several other priceless artifacts that had been shielded in the heart of the library. The university, eager to acquire the collection and the incredible story behind it, made Ilara an offer that she could only stare at in stunned silence. The number had 7 zeros. She sat with her new lawyer, watching the wire transfer confirm on a laptop screen. She felt a strange, quiet numbness as the number appeared. It wasn't the giddy joy of winning the lottery. It was the profound, bone-deep sensation of a heavy chain, worn for a lifetime, finally rusting through and falling away. The constant, gnawing pain of financial terror that had been her companion for so long simply dissolved, leaving behind a vast, quiet space. She was no longer drowning. She could finally breathe. The soft chime of the transfer confirmation was the single most beautiful sound she had ever heard, the sound of absolute, unassailable freedom. Ilara knew what she had to do. The money was not just for her and Leo, it was a debt owed to Alistair Blackwood. She used a portion of her newfound fortune to rebuild Blackwood Manor. It rose from the ashes, not as a private tomb, but as a public monument. The exterior was a faithful restoration of its former Gothic glory, but the interior was transformed. It became the Blackwood Museum and Library, dedicated to the town's true history and the immigrant families who had built it. The centerpiece was a perfect recreation of the secret library, filled with facsimiles of Alistair's research and the evidence he had died to protect. As Ilara walked through the polished halls, the air no longer smelled of rot and decay, but of fresh paint, lemon oil, and the quiet dignity of restored history. She was not a desperate squatter anymore. She was the guardian of a legacy, ensuring that the story of the Thorne deception and the man who exposed it would never again be forgotten. The contrast to her former life was a daily, breathtaking miracle. One crisp autumn evening, a year later, Ilara stood in the manor's warm, state-of-the-art kitchen. The room was filled with light and the rich, savory smells of roasting chicken and baking bread. There was no desperate counting of coins on a worn table, no gnawing hunger in her own stomach as she saved the last heel of bread for her son. Through the new, gleaming window, she watched Leo playing on a vast green lawn, his laughter echoing in the clear air. She felt the gentle, ambient warmth from the heating vents, a simple luxury that felt like the height of indulgence. Her heart ached with a profound, overwhelming gratitude. She was home, not just in a house, but in a state of being she thought she had lost forever. Safe, secure, happy. A single tear traced a path down her cheek, but for the first time in years, it was a tear of pure, unadulterated joy. The nightmare was over. Her life had been rewritten, from a tragedy of despair into a saga of justice and resilience. She had walked into a tomb and emerged with a key, not just to a secret room, but to her own future and the liberation of a century of silenced voices. Ilara's journey is a testament to the fact that even in the deepest darkness, a single person's courage, armed with the truth, can topple empires and reclaim a future from the ashes of the past. She didn't just find a fortune, she found her purpose, ensuring that no one would ever forget the price of justice. If you were inspired by Ilara's fight and believe that every story of survival deserves to be heard, subscribe to our channel. Join a community that celebrates the incredible power of the human spirit to overcome the impossible and rewrite its own ending.